The teddy bear that became the wealthiest of all time. Part 4. Welcome to True Unseen Crime, where the truth hides in plain sight. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the unseen is always closer than you think. The Whisperer was never his master, he was just his first victim. Monroe knew what was coming. The Bear King no longer needed a single host. It was spreading, turning its victims into silent puppets, leaving behind grinning faces and twisted minds. The hunt for Peterson. Monroe returned to Boston and traced Peterson's badge to an old textile mill on the city's outskirts. The building had been abandoned for years, yet candles now flickered behind broken windows. Inside, Monroe found crimson-robed figures gathered in a circle. At the center stood Agent Peterson, pale, grinning, with stitches carved into his face. And in his hands, Mr. Fuzzles. The bear's button eyes glowed faintly, and its crooked smile seemed to widen as Monroe stepped forward. "You should have let him feed," Peterson whispered in a voice that wasn't his own. "Now he's starving." The air turned frigid. Shadows slithered across the walls, twisting into grinning faces with soulless, button eyes. The final battle. Monroe drew the blade of St. Gallus and charged, slashing through the shadows as they closed in. The faces shrieked and dissolved, but the Bear King's presence only grew stronger. Peterson's body convulsed, the bear's grin now splitting wider as if feeding on his pain. "He's inside you now," Peterson rasped. "You can't stop him." Monroe lunged forward, plunging the blade directly into Mr. Fuzzles' chest. The bear let out a bone-chilling wail as its seams tore open. A wave of icy wind blasted through the room, snuffing out the candles and sending the crimson cultists tumbling to the ground. Peterson collapsed, the stitched grin peeling away from his face as if unwoven by invisible hands. And as for Mr. Fuzzles, the bear's once twisted grin had faded, but Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had simply retreated. The Whisperer's return. Days later, Monroe received a package. No sender, no return address. Inside was a single object, a small teddy bear. This one wasn't Mr. Fuzzles, yet its glassy button eyes seemed to watch him. And stitched carefully into its chest were 3 familiar words. "I'm still hungry." The Bear King's game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The package haunted Monroe. That new bear, smaller than Mr. Fuzzles, but stitched with the same crooked smile, now sat locked in a steel case inside his apartment. Monroe didn't dare leave it at the FBI office. Too many had already died. Yet every night, the whispers returned. Faint at first, then louder. He's still hungry, and now he's inside. The mark of the bear. Monroe woke one morning to a dull ache across his chest. When he lifted his shirt, his blood ran cold. A jagged, stitched smile was carved into his skin. Faint, but unmistakable. The Bear King had marked him. He wasn't just being haunted anymore. He was being claimed. The lost survivor. Desperate for answers, Monroe returned to the old Grimsby Hollow Church, now a sealed crime scene. There, tucked inside a rotted pew, he found something the FBI had missed, an old photograph. It showed Charles Hargrove, standing beside a young boy no older than 6. The boy clutched Mr. Fuzzles tightly, his face partially obscured. The back of the photo had 2 chilling words written in faded ink. "My heir." Monroe's mind raced. Had Hargrove's twisted ritual not only tethered his soul to Mr. Fuzzles, but also created an heir to carry the curse forward? If so, that child was now an adult and possibly the new Whisperer. The man in the shadows. Through old records, Monroe traced the boy to a man named Elias Hargrove, who had vanished 2 years earlier. His last known address led Monroe to a forgotten motel on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts. The room was dark when Monroe arrived, a musky stench lingering in the air. Tattered teddy bears lined the shelves, each one stitched with the Bear King's crooked grin. And on the wall, a map. Red strings stretched across multiple U.S. cities: Boston, Chicago, Denver, and Washington, D.C. Each marked location corresponded to missing person cases, Victims who had vanished with that same eerie calling card, a grinning teddy bear left behind. Then Monroe found something else, a leather-bound journal. Inside were entries scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I hear him," he whispers from the dark. "He's everywhere now. Not just in bears, but in people. I can't stop him, but I can hide him for now." The final entry read only 4 words. "He's sending the crawlers." The crawlers' arrival. That night, Monroe barely made it home before they arrived. It started with a knock, soft, rhythmic, unnatural. Through the peephole, Monroe saw nothing but shadows, shifting, moving. Then they stepped into the light. Pale figures, faces stretched into unnatural grins, their lips crudely stitched into smiles. They moved with jerking, inhuman motions, like marionettes with tangled strings. The crawlers had found him. The fight for survival. Monroe grabbed his firearm and braced himself. The crawlers scratched at the door, their whispers leaking through the cracks. "We see you, we see you, we see you." When they finally broke through, Monroe fired, but bullets did nothing. The crawlers kept coming, their grins widening with each step. Monroe had one chance, the steel case. He flung it open, grabbed the cursed teddy bear inside, and hurled it directly at the approaching crawlers. The result was instant. The bear's grin began to burn, glowing red-hot. The crawlers shrieked, clutching their faces as their stitched smiles melted away. One by one, they collapsed motionless. But as Monroe caught his breath, he noticed something horrifying. The cursed bear, the one that had saved him, was now grinning wider. The Bear King was feeding. The final warning. The next morning, Monroe found another message scrawled on his bathroom mirror in crimson letters. "He's no longer hunting, now he's building an army." Monroe knew what it meant. The Bear King's hunger had grown. The crawlers were just the beginning, and if Monroe didn't stop him soon, the stitched smile would spread across the country. Monroe couldn't ignore the writing on his mirror. "He's building an army." The crawlers were only the beginning. Monroe knew that if the Bear King was feeding, his reach would spread beyond whispers and cursed toys. He needed to find Elias Hargrove, the missing heir, before it was too late. The trail to Denver. Monroe's investigation pointed to one location that kept appearing in Elias' journal entries, a crumbling apartment complex in Denver, Colorado called Pine Hollow Towers. When Monroe arrived, the air felt wrong, stale and thick. The building had been abandoned for years, yet faint candlelight flickered in a few windows. Inside, the walls were covered in chalk drawings, crude stick figures, each one wearing a stitched smile. Monroe traced the drawings down the hall until he found something worse. A nursery. Dozens of teddy bears, small, large, worn, and brand new, filled the room. Each one had identical stitching across its mouth, and their button eyes gleamed faintly. But Monroe's stomach churned when he spotted the crib in the corner. Inside, a ragged teddy bear lay cradling something cold and rotting, a human skull. And on the wall above it, scrawled in Elias Hargrove's handwriting, was a chilling message. "The Bear King takes what he loves and keeps what he hates." The whisper's message. Monroe barely heard the footsteps before the figure stepped from the shadows. Elias Hargrove, his face gaunt and sunken. He clutched a teddy bear tightly to his chest, its grin stretched impossibly wide. "He's here," Elias rasped. "He's always here." Monroe reached for his weapon, but Elias shook his head. "You can't kill him," Elias whispered. "He doesn't die, he just spreads." Then Elias lifted his shirt to reveal his stomach. His skin was stitched tight with black thread, a smiling face stretched across his abdomen. "I tried to stop him," Elias choked. "But now, I'm his voice." Elias lurched forward, and the bear in his arms twitched. Its head jerked toward Monroe, and its stitched grin twitched wider. The whispers began, louder this time. "He's coming, he's coming, he's coming." The Bear King's return. The walls convulsed, shadows rippled like dark waves. The teddy bears in the nursery began to stir, twitching their limbs, shifting their heads toward Monroe. Elias staggered back as something stepped from the wall, a figure cloaked in blackened fur. The air grew ice cold, and Monroe felt his vision blur. The Bear King had returned. It wasn't a bear anymore. The creature was tall, almost 7 feet, with twisted limbs that bent unnaturally. Its face was a patchwork of skin and fabric, half human, half stuffed bear, with lifeless button eyes that locked onto Monroe. The stitched smile curled wider, revealing jagged, rotting teeth beneath the thread. "He's hungry," Elias croaked. The creature lunged. The escape. Monroe barely made it out. He overturned the crib, igniting the fabric bears with a flick of his lighter. As flames engulfed the room, the Bear King's twisted face flickered in the smoke, grinning but furious. Elias stumbled after Monroe, clutching his stitched stomach. "It's too late," he whispered. "He's everywhere now, in their minds, in their hearts, in their smiles." Monroe didn't look back. He knew Elias was right. The Bear King didn't just possess people anymore. He had turned smiles into weapons. The final warning. Back in Boston, Monroe discovered dozens of new reports, towns where people had vanished, leaving behind only a grinning bear. In one case, an entire kindergarten class had disappeared overnight, their classroom empty except for a circle of smiling teddy bears. The Bear King wasn't feeding anymore.
He was multiplying.
Now Monroe had only one goal: find a way to stop the Bear King's plague before every stitched smile swallowed the nation. But as he reached for his phone, he froze. On his window, pressed against the glass, was a single blood-red handprint, and scrawled beneath it, "You're mine." Monroe knew running wouldn't save him. The Bear King's reach wasn't limited to shadows anymore. It was spreading like an infection. If he didn't act now, the plague of stitched smiles would consume the nation. He needed answers, and fast. The forgotten ritual. Monroe dug through every file the FBI had collected on Charles Hargrove, Elias, and Mr. Fuzzles. Buried in an old archive folder, he found something chilling: a journal entry from one of Hargrove's former housekeepers. It described a night in 1971 when Hargrove held a secret gathering, a ritual. The entry mentioned hooded figures chanting in an unknown language and a name that sent chills down Monroe's spine: Ursa Malficarum. The Bear King's true name. The ritual, it seemed, had been an attempt to bargain with something powerful, a twisted force tied to greed, fear, and obsession. But what struck Monroe most was the warning written at the bottom of the entry. If the Bear King's smile spreads, only the Forgotten Five can silence him. The Forgotten Five. Monroe's search led him to a retired folklore professor named Dr. Isaac Greaves, who specialized in obscure rituals and curses. Greaves' face turned pale at the mention of Ursa Malficarum. "The Forgotten Five, that's a dangerous path," Greaves muttered. He explained that the Forgotten Five were artifacts, each linked to a force powerful enough to suppress dark entities. The Ashen Bell, forged from cursed iron. The Glass Heart, rumored to hold the tears of a betrayed saint. The Whispering Coin, marked with symbols said to silence demons. The Crimson Key, crafted from bone, known to trap spirits. The Candle of the Forsaken, a single black candle that burns with cold flame. Individually, they hold power, Greaves warned. But together, they're the only thing strong enough to seal something like the Bear King. Monroe had no choice. He had to track them down. The hunt begins. Monroe's first lead took him to a remote chapel in Arkansas, where the Ashen Bell was said to be kept. The bell was hidden in a crypt beneath the altar, guarded by rumors of spirits that cursed anyone who tried to take it. The moment Monroe entered the crypt, the air turned ice cold. In the darkness, faint whispers began, low, distorted voices repeating the same phrase. "Smile, smile, smile." Monroe reached the bell's case, but as his fingers touched the glass, he felt something behind him. A face, twisted and pale, a stitched smile carved across its skin. It wasn't just a crawler this time. This one was different. Its eyes glowed faintly red. It was one of the marked. The marked attack. The marked lunged, arms flailing. Monroe dodged and smashed the glass. The Ashen Bell hit the floor with a deafening clang. The marked shrieked and stumbled back, clawing at its face as its stitched grin began to smolder. Monroe grabbed the bell and sprinted out of the crypt, the whispers fading as he crossed the threshold. One artifact down, 4 to go. The Bear King's trick. That night, Monroe checked into a motel, clutching the ashen bell tightly. But sleep brought no peace. In his dreams, Monroe stood in a room of mirrors, hundreds of reflections, but none of them moved when he did. Instead, each reflection slowly grinned, their lips curling into that unnatural stitched smile. Then one of the reflections spoke, a twisted voice that crackled like dry leaves. "You can't stop me, Monroe." The Bear King's face appeared in the largest mirror, his glassy black eyes burning crimson. "You can collect your precious trinkets, but I'll find you before you finish." Then Monroe saw something worse. The Bear King's reflection lifted a hand, and in its grasp was a photograph. His sister. She lived alone in Vermont, miles from all this chaos. Or so Monroe had believed. The Bear King grinned wider. "She's smiling already." The race against time. Monroe woke in a cold sweat. The Bear King wasn't waiting for him to finish his quest. He was hunting Monroe's family, and likely anyone else Monroe had ever cared about. The Bear King's message was clear. If Monroe couldn't find the Forgotten Five fast enough, everyone he loved would be stitched with a smile. Monroe didn't have time to think. He had to reach his sister, and fast. The Bear King's warning wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. The Vermont rescue. Monroe drove through the night, crossing into Vermont just after dawn. His sister, Emily, lived in a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. When Monroe arrived, something felt wrong. The curtains were drawn, and the air was too still. He knocked. No answer. When he tried the door, it creaked open on its own. Inside, the house was cold, unnaturally cold. The air smelled faintly of burnt fabric, and dark smudges, like soot, stained the walls. On the kitchen table sat a teddy bear, old, ragged, and slouched on its side. Its grin was stitched wide. Monroe's blood turned cold. "Emily," he called out, his voice tight. A faint voice answered from upstairs. "Monroe?" The smiling shadow. He bolted up the stairs, heart pounding. Emily's bedroom door was ajar. Monroe stepped inside, and there she was. Emily stood in the corner, her back turned to him. It's me," Monroe whispered. She didn't move. "Emily?" Slowly, she turned, and Monroe's breath caught. A stitched smile stretched across her mouth. Black thread pierced her lips, holding the twisted grin in place. But her eyes, they were filled with tears, silently pleading. Suddenly, behind her, a figure shifted in the shadows. The marked. This one was taller, its face barely human, a mess of blackened skin and stitched seams. Its smile stretched wide, and as it stepped forward, its glassy button eyes gleamed crimson. It whispered one word. "Smile." The confrontation. Monroe lunged for Emily, but the marked moved fast. Its twisted arms reached out, fingers tipped with rusty needles. Monroe swung the ashen bell. The clang shook the room like thunder. The marked reeled back, clutching its face as smoke curled from its stitches. "Go, Emily," Monroe shouted, dragging her toward the stairs. The marked snarled. The stitches on its face snapped, splitting open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. But Monroe wasn't done. He grabbed a bottle of lighter fluid from the hallway shelf, doused the bear on the table, and struck a match. Flames erupted, and for a moment, the marked scream sounded almost human. Then it was gone. Emily gasped for breath, trembling as Monroe carefully cut the stitches from her mouth. Blood trickled down her chin, but she was alive. "He whispered to me," she choked. He showed me things." Monroe knew what that meant. Emily had seen the Bear King, and those who saw him rarely escaped for long. The glass heart secret. Before leaving Vermont, Monroe followed a lead on the next artifact, the glass heart. Legend claimed it was kept inside an old church, St. Mercy's Chapel, a forgotten relic from the 1800s. The chapel was half buried in vines, its doors warped with age. Inside, Monroe found an altar, and above it, a statue of an angel clutching a heart-shaped crystal. But before he could reach it, Monroe noticed something horrifying. The statue's face had changed. The angel's serene expression was gone, replaced by a grotesque stitched smile. A voice rasped from behind him. "You're too late." Monroe turned and froze. The marked from Emily's house was back. Only this time, it wasn't alone. 3 more figures emerged from the shadows, each one with button eyes and grins stitched wide. "The Whisper's game." The lead marked chuckled darkly. "The Whisper knows where you're going, and he's waiting." With a twisted grin, the mark's face split wider, and from the gap emerged something black and crawling, a twisted, writhing mass of thread and teeth. Monroe grabbed the glass heart and bolted for the door. The marked lunged, but Monroe rang the ashen bell once more. The shriek of burning stitches filled the air. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. The Bear King's warning. That night, Monroe received a message on his phone, an image with no sender. It showed his motel room, empty, except for a single teddy bear sitting on the pillow. And scrawled in red letters across the wall were the words, "You're making him angry." Monroe knew what that meant. The Bear King wasn't just waiting anymore. He was hunting. Monroe had no more time to waste. The Bear King's web was tightening, and the stitched smiles were spreading faster than he could contain. With the ashen bell and glass heart in his possession, he had 2 of the forgotten 5. But the Whisperer and the Bear King were closing in. Monroe's only chance was to stop them before they reached him. The Whisperer's hideout. Through coded messages intercepted by the FBI, Monroe discovered that the Whisperer was hiding in an abandoned textile factory in Cleveland, Ohio, a fitting lair for someone controlling an army of stitched-faced followers. Armed with the 2 artifacts and a desperate plan, Monroe headed straight for the factory. Inside, the air reeked of burnt cloth and mildew. Faded posters of smiling teddy bears lined the walls, promotional material from an old toy company. And there, in the center of the room, stood the Whisperer. He was nothing like Monroe expected, a thin, wiry man in a tattered suit, his face obscured by a mask of burlap stitched with a twisted grin. But the Whisperer wasn't alone. Behind him, suspended like twisted marionettes, stood 6 marked, each of their faces frozen in those cursed, stitched smiles. And at the Whisperer's feet, Mr. Fuzzles. The bear's glassy black eyes gleamed crimson, and its smile seemed almost alive. The Whisperer's gambit. "You can't win," the Whisperer rasped. His voice sounded jagged, like metal scraping against stone. "You're just one man. The Bear King's already claimed this world, one smile at a time." He gestured to the marked, and they lurched forward. Monroe rang the ashen bell. The marked staggered, their stitches burning like embered rope. But the Whisperer only laughed. "The bell weakens us," he taunted. But the Bear King? He's stronger now than ever. Behind him, Mr. Fuzzles twitched. Its head turned, the bear's gaze locking directly onto Monroe. And then, it blinked. The Bear King awakens. The air turned cold. The marked froze in place, their smiles growing wider as black threads slithered from their mouths like worms. The Whisperer's grin faltered. "He's here," he whispered. Mr. Fuzzles slowly rose to its feet, limbs bending with a sickening pop. The Bear King's voice poured from the bear's stitched smile, low and distorted, like a distant radio signal crackling through static. "You should have left me buried." Monroe knew he couldn't win this with brute force. He had to finish what Charles Hargrove had started, the sealing ritual. This is True Unseen Crime, where the unseen reveals the unexpected. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes silence can be deadlier than a scream. The final ritual. Monroe grabbed the glass heart and hurled it to the ground. The crystal shattered into shards, sending ripples of cold energy through the room. The marked shrieked, clutching their faces. The Whisperer staggered back, screaming as black threads began unraveling from his body. But Mr. Fuzzles didn't stop. The bear's form grew, twisting and contorting until it towered over Monroe, a monstrous figure of matted fur, exposed bone, and endless rows of teeth. Monroe rang the ashen bell again. This time, the bear recoiled, smoke curling from its seams. "And oh," the Bear King roared. Monroe reached into his bag and pulled out the final weapon, a crude figure carved from bone. The crimson key. "You can't stop me," the Bear King snarled, lunging forward. Monroe jammed the crimson key into the bear's chest. The air imploded, a deafening roar of wind and whispers. The Bear King's face twisted in agony as crimson light flared from his stitches. Threads snapped. Stitches unraveled. And then the bear crumbled into dust. The marked collapsed, their twisted grins fading. And the whisper was gone. The aftermath. The FBI arrived hours later. Monroe had nothing to show them but an empty room filled with ash and a single torn button, all that remained of Mr. Fuzzles. The stitched smiles vanished from those afflicted. The world slowly returned to normal. But Monroe knew one thing for certain. Evil never dies completely. Somewhere in some forgotten corner of the world, a crimson thread still waits to be pulled. And when it is, the Bear King may smile again. This is True Unseen Crime, where the unseen reveals the unexpected. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes silence can be deadlier than a scream.